The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above the long corridor of the armory, casting a sterile glow against the concrete walls. The base had quieted down after another grueling day of field training, and most soldiers had already retreated to the barracks or the mess hall for a late dinner. But Sergeant Elena Marcus walked alone, her boots steady against the polished floor, carrying 2 rifles across her arms like a practiced weight. The weapons weren't particularly heavy standard M4 carbines, both signed out earlier that afternoon for range drills, but Elena's measured pace suggested more than simple fatigue. She carried them as if she carried responsibility. It was always like this after training days. A handful of soldiers failed to return their weapons on time, leaving it to the more responsible among them to do the chore. Elena never minded. In fact, she preferred the quiet of the armory in the evening. The chaos of the day, the shouting of drill instructors, the crack of rifle fire at the range, the endless cadence of orders gave way to a silence that almost felt sacred once the base wound down. The armory, with its faint smell of oil and gunmetal, was a place of order in a world that too often felt chaotic. Behind the counter, Captain James Harlan looked up from a stack of maintenance reports. He was in his 40s, with a square jaw and a kind of expression that rarely shifted from stern neutrality. Harlan had spent most of his career in the infantry, only recently reassigned to the armory due to a leg injury sustained overseas. Some thought it was a soft landing. He thought of it as exile. But the army didn't ask for opinions. "Evening, Sergeant," he said, voice steady, almost disinterested. "Evening, sir," Elena replied, placing the rifles carefully on the steel counter. She smoothed her sleeve instinctively, her posture straight, her tone crisp. No wasted movements, no sloppy behavior. Everything about her screamed regulation. Harlan pulled one of the rifles toward him and began his usual inspection. He checked the chamber, then the bolt carrier group, his motions practiced from years of habit. Clean, oiled, no obvious issues. He scribbled a note onto the clipboard in front of him, then reached for the second weapon. He had done this process thousands of times. Weapons came in, weapons went out. Routine, predictable, almost boring. But as he looked up to ask Elena for her serial number, his eyes caught on something unusual. Her identification badge, clipped neatly to her chest pocket, glinted under the fluorescent light. Harlan's gaze, drawn there by accident, froze when he saw the word etched faintly beneath her name and rank. Crosswind. The word was out of place, entirely foreign in this context. Military badges displayed rank, branch, clearance level. Sometimes a unit designation, sometimes a security status. But never codenames. Never single words stamped beneath an enlisted soldier's identity. Harlan's hand stilled on the rifle, his jaw tightening. For a moment he wondered if his eyes had deceived him, if perhaps it was some unit nickname he didn't recognize. But no, he had been in the army too long not to know what he was seeing. The word wasn't decoration. It was a mark. He quickly dropped his eyes back to the rifle, forcing his expression into neutrality before Elena could notice his reaction. But inside, a memory stirred, half buried, half forgotten. He had heard that word before, crosswind, back during his second deployment overseas, whispered by intelligence officers who never wore uniforms and never gave their real names. They spoke of crosswind like it was both a weapon and a shadow, a program designed to slip unnoticed into the military's own ranks. A counterintelligence initiative, if the rumors were true. But the details had always been vague, wrapped in secrecy, and after a scandal years ago, Washington had publicly claimed the project was shut down. So why was it here? On the badge of a quiet logistics sergeant who was just returning rifles at the end of a long training day? Harlan cleared his throat, disguising the sudden tightness in his chest. "You just coming off the range, Sergeant?" He asked casually, sliding the rifle back toward her. "Yes, sir," Elena said, her tone polite, unremarkable. She didn't flinch under his gaze, didn't betray any sign that her badge carried a secret weight. Her dark hair was pulled tightly into regulation bun, her uniform crisped despite the long day. Everything about her presentation was neat, ordinary. Too ordinary, Harlan thought. Soldiers who looked that clean after 12 hours of drills usually had something to hide. He signed her logbook entry with deliberate slowness, buying himself time. He wanted to ask, needed to ask, but training told him not to push too quickly. The Army had a rhythm, a dance between authority and obedience, and pressing too hard would only make her suspicious. Instead, he kept his tone even, casual. "Where are you from, Sergeant?" "San Antonio, sir," Elena replied without hesitation. "Good city?" Harlan said, nodding. "Did my basic there years ago?" "What about training?" "Jackson?" "Yes, sir." "Fort Jackson," she said smoothly. Every answer was sharp, precise, as if she had rehearsed them. Harlan's instincts prickled. Soldiers often stumbled on small talk, laughing, joking, throwing in details about drill sergeants or favorite chow hall meals. Elena gave him nothing. No warmth, no wasted words. The rifles between them felt like props now, the routine transaction masking something deeper. As she waited for him to complete the paperwork, Elena shifted her stance slightly, eyes forward, hands clasped behind her back. She didn't fidget, didn't glance around the room. She stood like a statue carved from discipline. But Harlan wasn't looking at her posture anymore. His mind kept circling back to that single word on her badge. Crosswind. It didn't belong. It didn't make sense. And if his suspicions were right, it meant that Elena Marcus was not the soldier she appeared to be. Harlan signed off the last box and slid the clipboard toward her. "All set, Sergeant? You're free to go." "Thank you, sir," Elena said. She picked up her copy of the form, gave a sharp salute, and turned to leave. Her boots echoed down the hallway, fading into silence. Harlan sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. The rifles were secured. The paperwork was complete. Everything about the exchange was routine, perfectly ordinary, except for the badge, except for Crosswind. He rubbed his jaw, the memory gnawing at him like a half-remembered nightmare. The word carried weight, a hidden history. And now, somehow, it had found its way back into his armory, attached to a soldier who had no reason to carry it. Harlan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know whether to feel curiosity or dread. But one thing was certain. Sergeant Elena Marcus was not just another name on his roster. Something was happening on this base, and he had just stumbled into it, without meaning to, without warning. And it all started with a routine task. Captain James Harlan stayed at his desk long after Sergeant Elena Marcus had left. The armory was quiet now, the smell of oil and metal heavier in the still air. He could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second dragging on, reminding him that he should have gone back to his quarters hours ago. But he couldn't shake the word from his mind. Crosswind. It hadn't been a mistake. He had seen it clear as day, etched into the corner of her badge in a way that almost dared someone to notice. If she had meant to hide it, she hadn't done a good job. Yet, maybe that was the point. Maybe Crosswind worked best when it was hidden in plain sight, daring someone curious enough to ask, reckless enough to poke where they weren't wanted. Harlan wasn't reckless, but he was curious. Too curious. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Years of deployments, years of dealing with shadows and war zones, had trained him to recognize when something was wrong. And everything about Sergeant Marcus was too clean, too sharp, too precise. Soldiers carried scars on their uniforms, their bodies, their eyes. But Elena had walked in like a soldier from a recruitment poster. Perfect, unblemished, almost unreal. The army didn't make people like that. Not naturally. The next morning, Harlan forced himself into routine. He conducted weapons inspections, checked supply lists, and filed reports. But all day, his mind wandered back to Elena's badge. When he saw her again, it was during morning formation. She stood in line with the others, her eyes forward, her body rigid. There was nothing outwardly different about her. To any casual observer, she blended seamlessly with the rest of her unit. But Harlan's eyes lingered. And again, he saw it Crosswind. The word burned into his thoughts like a brand. When formation ended, he caught her on her way back to the barracks. "Sergeant Marquez," he called out, his tone neutral. She stopped immediately, turned, and saluted. "Sir." "At ease," Harlan said, lowering his voice slightly. "Walk with me." She fell into step beside him, her posture perfect. They moved down the corridor, the sound of their boots echoing against the concrete. Harlan kept his eyes forward, speaking in a low, conversational tone. "Where'd you say you trained?" he asked. "Fort Jackson, sir." "And your MO is?" 9-2I, Unit Supply Specialist, she replied without hesitation. Harlan nodded slowly. Everything about her answers was correct, by the book. But that was the problem too, by the book. Soldiers usually added color to their stories, small personal details. Elena never did. Her words were like a script. He decided to push a little further. "Jackson, huh? I remember a drill sergeant Hayes there. Mean as hell. Ever cross paths with him?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second. Then she smiled faintly. "Can't say I did, sir." It was the first unpolished thing she had said since he met her. And it was wrong. Every soldier had a story about a drill sergeant, usually more than one. They were unforgettable. Harlan kept his face neutral, but his suspicion deepened. That night, Harlan stayed late in his office again. He poured himself coffee, opened his laptop, and began digging through restricted personnel files. It was dangerous crossing into areas he wasn't supposed to access, but he still had enough clearance to slip through some of the cracks. He pulled up Elena Marquez's file. It was sparse. Too sparse. A soldier with her time in service should have had pages of records, training scores, fitness evaluations, deployment history, commendations. Instead, there were a handful of entries. Her enlistment, basic training, assignment to the current base. Then, lines of black redaction that swallowed everything else. And there it was again, in bold. Authorized under Project Crosswind, no further inquiry permitted. Harlan rubbed his temple, staring at the words. Crosswind. It was real. He hadn't imagined it, hadn't misremembered rumors. The project existed. It existed now, and Sergeant Elena Marquez was part of it. But what exactly was Crosswind? Harlan leaned back, closing his eyes. Memories stirred. He remembered Afghanistan years ago, when one of his men had been court-martialed after leaking intel. Back then, whispers had spread through the ranks about Crosswind, an invisible watchdog, a shadow program embedding operatives inside units to sniff out traitors before damage was done. But the program had been controversial. Some said it violated soldiers' rights. Others said it was corrupt. Then, just as quickly as the whispers had come, they disappeared. Officially, Crosswind was shut down. Officially. Harlan looked at the file again. Alana's records were sealed tighter than most Special Forces operators. Someone didn't want anyone asking questions. He should have stopped there. Closed the laptop. Pretended he'd seen nothing. But curiosity was a dangerous thing. The next day, Harlan found himself watching Elena more closely. During weapons issue, he noticed her interactions. She was polite but distant, never letting anyone too close. She never lingered in groups, never joined the easy banter soldiers used to survive long days. Instead, she observed, always observing. When another soldier fumbled with his paperwork, Elena stepped in instantly, correcting the mistake with quiet precision. Not helpful, not friendly surgical. Harlan saw the others look at her oddly, as if they couldn't quite place her either. She was part of the unit, but not of the unit. Harlan's suspicion hardened into certainty. She wasn't here for supply work. She was here for something else. Something buried under the name Crosswind. But what? Later that evening, he staged a subtle test. As Elena returned another weapon to the armory, Harlan pretended to skim through her paperwork. Strange thing, he said casually. Your badge caught my eye yesterday. That designation under your name Crosswind. What's that about? For the first time, her posture faltered. Only slightly a flicker in her eyes, a pause in her breathing, but Harlan caught it. Just an internal code, sir, she said smoothly, recovering. Supply tracking. Nothing important. Her words were calm. Too calm. Harlan didn't press. Not yet, but the confirmation was enough. Crosswind wasn't a coincidence. It was real, it was active, and Sergeant Elena Marquez carried it with her like a hidden weapon. And Harlan knew deep down that whatever it meant, it was going to drag him into something far beyond rifles and supply reports. Something dangerous. That night, as he walked back to his quarters, Harlan felt the weight of it pressing down on him. The base seemed quieter than usual, the shadows longer, the wind sharper against his face. He thought about Elena's calm eyes, her measured words, the way she moved like someone trained for more than logistics. He thought about the mole years ago, the betrayal, the damage it caused. And he thought about Crosswind back from the dead, walking the halls of his base with a badge that dared him to notice. James Harlan knew one thing for certain. Curiosity would not let him go. And curiosity was the first step into the storm. Captain James Harlan had never been a man given to paranoia. 20 years in uniform had taught him that suspicion, like rust, could eat through discipline if left unchecked. And yet, in all his deployments, all his nights patrolling deserts and forests, he had never felt the slow-burning unease that now gnawed at him inside his own base. Sergeant Elena Marquez had become the source of that unease. The morning after he'd confronted her about the strange word on her badge, Harlan found himself thinking about her during breakfast in the mess hall. He ate mechanically powdered eggs, toast, coffee, but his mind replayed the look in her eyes when he mentioned Crosswind. Calm, too calm. Soldiers weren't good at hiding nerves when they were caught in a lie. Elena hadn't blinked. That in itself was the problem. Later that day, Harlan arranged to see her again, this time under the pretext of double-checking rifles returning from a small training exercise. It was the kind of mundane errand no one would question. Elena walked into the armory right on time, carrying 2 rifles balanced with perfect posture. The same way she had that first night. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair tucked neatly into a bun, not a strand out of place. Sir, she said crisply, placing the weapons on the counter. Sergeant, Harlan replied with equal formality. He pulled one rifle toward him, opening the chamber. The weapon was spotless, cleaned with care. He didn't really need to check. It was always spotless when she handled it. He cleared his throat, pretending to focus on the inspection. Tell me something, Sergeant. You said Fort Jackson for basic, right? Yes, sir. Interesting. I trained at Benning. Big difference, but Jackson's got a reputation. Lot of soldiers complain about the food. What was your experience? Elena's face was neutral. The food was fine, sir. That was it. No elaboration, no smirk, no anecdote. Most soldiers would have given him a story about bland chow, about drill sergeants yelling over trays of half-cooked eggs, about sneaking extra snacks from vending machines. Elena gave him nothing. Harlan nodded slowly, hiding his growing suspicion. He shifted to the second rifle. And after basic you said you went straight into supply? Yes, sir. 9-2Y. Always been interested in logistics? Her answer came without hesitation. I serve where I'm needed, sir. Harlan's eyes flicked up. Her words weren't wrong. They weren't even unusual. But the tone, the precision, the lack of hesitation made his skin crawl. It sounded less like a soldier talking about a career and more like an operative repeating a mission statement. He tried another angle. Where's your family from, Sergeant? San Antonio, sir. You get back often? No, sir. My work keeps me here. Her answers were crisp, efficient. But she was leaving nothing personal on the table. Every response sounded like it had been scrubbed clean of detail, sanitized until it was nothing but truth without story. Harlan decided to press harder, this time testing her memory. He leaned on the counter, his tone casual. I used to know a sergeant named Vasquez out of San Antonio. Good man. You ever cross paths with him? For the briefest second, something flickered in Elena's eyes. Then it was gone. No, sir. He nodded, filing the reaction away. Shame. He retired a few years back. Still keeps in touch with some folks down there. I figured you might have crossed paths. No, sir, she repeated firmly. Her voice carried no warmth, no curiosity. Most people would have asked more. Who was he? What unit? But Elena shut the door completely. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Harlan finished the inspection, signed the paperwork, and handed it back. All set, he said. Thank you, sir. She saluted and turned to leave. Harlan watched her go, his mind racing. She had passed every question without stumbling, yet the very perfection of her answers told him she wasn't what she seemed. Soldiers weren't perfect. They were messy, rough, scarred by service. Elena was a mask, and behind that mask was something he needed to understand. That night, Harlan couldn't sleep. He paced his quarters, the weight of memory pressing down on him. He remembered whispers from Afghanistan about intelligence operatives hidden among regular units. Ghosts in uniform, they called them. Watching, listening, reporting. Back then, he dismissed it as rumor. Campfire stories spun to explain why some soldiers suddenly disappeared after investigations. Now he wasn't so sure. Crosswind, it had to be connected. And if it was, then Elena Marquez wasn't just another sergeant. She was here for a reason. But what reason? The following day, Harlan tried a different approach. He didn't summon her. Instead, he observed her in the field during another training exercise. From a distance, he watched as she managed equipment distribution. She moved efficiently, always one step ahead, anticipating needs before they were spoken. She never lingered with the others during breaks, never joined their laughter or complaints. Instead, she stood slightly apart, her eyes scanning the group like a silent observer cataloging behaviors. It wasn't just discipline. It was surveillance. Harlan felt his stomach tighten. Later, he intercepted her on her way back. "Sergeant," he said, falling into step beside her. "Sir?" He walked in silence for a moment, then said casually, "You're sharp." Always squared away. Not many soldiers your age carry themselves like that. "Discipline is important, sir," she replied evenly. "True, but discipline only gets you so far. Instinct fills in the rest. And instinct comes from experience." He glanced at her. "You seem like someone who's seen more than her record says." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I serve where I'm needed, sir." The same phrase as before. Almost like a shield. Harlan stopped walking, turning to face her. "Crosswind," he said quietly. The word slipped out before he could stop himself. Her eyes locked on his, cold and sharp. For the first time, her mask cracked, not completely, but enough. There was a flicker of something dangerous, something controlled. Then she blinked, her expression smoothing. "Excuse me, sir?" she said, her tone polite but tight. Harlan held her gaze. "I notice things, Sergeant." "More than most." She didn't reply. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the unspoken pressing between them. Then Elena gave a crisp salute. "Permission to return to duty, sir?" Harlan nodded slowly. "Granted." She turned and walked away, her posture as rigid as ever. But Harlan knew he had rattled her. Just slightly. And in that crack, he had found confirmation. Crosswind was real. She was part of it. And he had just stepped into something far bigger than he understood. That night, alone in his office, Harlan stared at his reflection in the darkened window. He felt the pull of two instincts, one screaming at him to leave it alone, the other demanding answers. He knew himself well enough to recognize which instinct would win. The questions had already taken root. And James Harlan was not a man who could live with unanswered questions. Captain James Harlan had always trusted routine. It was the rhythm of military life, the steady march of duty reports, weapons checks, uniform inspections. Routine kept soldiers alive. Routine kept chaos at bay. But routine had been shattered the moment he noticed the single word on Sergeant Elena Marcus's badge. Now, days later, the thought of it gnawed at him constantly. Crosswind. The word followed him everywhere, in the cadence of boots on pavement, in the hiss of rifle fire during training, in the silence of the armory at night. He caught himself staring at Marcus more often, cataloging her movements. She was a ghost among soldiers, there but not present, efficient but not personable. And he knew, in the marrow of his bones, that she wasn't who she claimed to be. Harlan's office was tucked in the rear of the armory, a narrow space lined with filing cabinets, supply ledgers, and a battered desk scarred by years of paperwork. That night, after the others had gone, he sat there alone. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound. A mug of coffee, long gone cold, sat beside his laptop. He hesitated before logging in. He had clearance. Enough to do his job. Enough to pull personnel records when necessary. But what he was about to do went beyond necessity. It wasn't his duty. In fact, it might cost him his career. Still, the itch of curiosity was unbearable. He typed Marcus's name into the database. Her file popped up on screen, and immediately he felt a chill. It was thin. Too thin. A soldier with her years of service should have had pages upon pages. Evaluations, duty assignments, training scores, medical records. Instead, the file contained only the barest essentials: enlistment, basic training, a few notations about her role in supply. Everything else had been stripped away. And then he saw it. Authorized under Project Crosswind, no further inquiry permitted. The phrase stared back at him in bold type, surrounded by redacted lines like barbed wire. His pulse quickened. Crosswind wasn't just a rumor. It wasn't a ghost story whispered in desert tents. It was here, alive and sanctioned. Harlan leaned back, running a hand over his jaw. The name alone pulled him into the past. Afghanistan. The heat, the dust, the endless patrols. He remembered a soldier in his unit, Private Lewis, caught smuggling out encrypted drives. No one knew how he'd been discovered. Rumors spread like wildfire, soldiers whispering about ghosts in their ranks, shadows watching from within. Someone had said the word then, late at night around a flickering lantern. Crosswind. The program had been disavowed soon after, blamed for mishandled investigations and overreach. Soldiers accused it of planting suspicion, of turning units against themselves. Washington had promised it was dead. But here it was, stamped in black and white on Marcus's file. Harlan should have stopped. Every instinct screamed at him to close the file, log out, and pretend he'd seen nothing. But he couldn't. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then typed deeper commands, slipping past security restrictions with the ease of someone who had spent years navigating military systems. A new screen opened fragments of heavily redacted reports. Names were blacked out, locations blurred, but certain phrases leapt out like sparks: embedded assets, counterintelligence monitoring, threat detection protocols, and one line that froze him: operative authorized to assume standard soldier role for indefinite period. Cover identities protected by highest clearance. Operative, not soldier. Elena Marquez wasn't logistics. She wasn't supply. She was an embedded asset, an undercover operative planted in his unit for reasons still hidden under thick blocks of redaction. Harlan exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. He had seen classified before. He had lived with secrets, carried them in silence. But this was different. This wasn't about foreign enemies. This was about the army itself, about shadows moving within its own ranks. And now, by prying into this file, he had stepped across a line. He was about to log out when the screen flickered. A warning flashed. Unauthorized access detected. Session logged. Harlan cursed under his breath, quickly closing the file. His heart hammered. The system tracked everything. His clearance might have opened the door, but the system would record his attempt. Someone would see it. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And if Crosswind was what he thought it was, they wouldn't take kindly to him sniffing around their operative. He stared at the blank laptop screen, the silence of the armory pressing in on him. For the first time in years, he felt fear, not the kind that came from gunfire or explosions, but the quieter, colder kind. The kind that whispered he had just drawn the attention of something far bigger than himself. Over the next few days, Harlan moved carefully. He kept his eyes on Elena during formation, during weapons checks, during training support. She was as precise as ever, her discipline flawless. But now, every movement carried a different weight. He wasn't looking at a soldier anymore. He was looking at an operative. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way her eyes tracked conversations without joining them. The way she wrote notes quickly, then tore them up just as quickly. The way she lingered near communication equipment longer than most supply specialists would ever need to. The picture was becoming clearer. She was watching, listening, recording, and if Crosswind had embedded her here, it meant they suspected something. Someone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the base in long shadows, Harlan saw her alone near the motor pool. She was writing in a small notebook, her brow furrowed. When she noticed him, she closed it instantly and slipped it into her pocket with the casual ease of someone trained to hide. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she gave a sharp nod. "Evening, sir." "Evening, Sergeant," Harlan replied, his tone even. She walked past him, boots crunching against gravel. But the notebook weighed heavier in his mind than any rifle. That night, Harlan sat in his office again, the words from her file echoing in his head. Embedded asset, operative, cover identities. He thought of his soldiers, of the trust that bound a unit together. If one of them was being watched, if suspicion had already taken root, then the foundation of that trust was at risk. And now he, too, was part of it. Because he knew. He closed his eyes, the image of her badge sharp in his mind. Crosswind. It wasn't just a word anymore. It was a storm gathering on the horizon. and he had just walked straight into it. Sleep didn't come easily to Captain James Harlan. Not anymore. Long after lights out, he sat at the edge of his bunk, staring at the dark. His barracks room was Spartan. Nothing more than a cot, a footlocker, and a desk with papers neatly stacked. Yet the space felt crowded with memories, crowded with ghosts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the word burned across Elena Marquez's file, Crosswind. It wasn't the first time he had heard it, and that was what unsettled him most. He had been a younger man then, 12 years back, sweating under the Afghan sun. His unit had been stationed outside Kandahar, tasked with route security and village patrols. The days blurred together. Dust storms, the smell of diesel fuel, the constant hum of helicopters overhead. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. They fought shadows. They hunted whispers. And in the middle of it, one of his own soldiers, Private First Class Lewis, was arrested. It had been sudden, brutal. Military police stormed their outpost in the dead of night, dragging Lewis from his bunk. The man was screaming, insisting he was innocent, his voice echoing against the concrete walls. His brothers in arms watched in stunned silence. No explanation was given. 2 days later, the whispers started. Someone said Lewis had been caught smuggling classified radio frequencies on a thumb drive. Someone else claimed he'd been trading intel for cash, slipping information through civilian contractors. No one knew for sure. The only thing that was clear was that someone had caught him. That was when Harlan first heard the name, Crosswind. It spread through the platoon like wildfire, always whispered, never spoken aloud in daylight. Crosswind found him, one soldier said. They plant ghosts in the ranks, watching us. Another swore he'd seen a soldier in the chow hall who didn't belong, just watching, silent. Some believed it was an Army seed program. Others claimed it was CIA. Some went further, muttering about black-budget projects that reported only to generals in Washington. But no one really knew. Then, just as quickly, the rumors stopped. Official reports claimed Lewis had been discovered through routine checks. No mention of Crosswind. When soldiers pressed for answers, they were silenced with warnings. Drop it. Not your concern. Harlan had dropped it. He was a captain, not an investigator. His job was to keep his men alive, not chase shadows. But the memory lingered, and the name stuck in the back of his mind, buried under years of other battles. Until now. Now, sitting alone in his quarters, he realized the whispers had been true. Crosswind wasn't just a ghost story. It was real. And Elena Marquez was living proof. He stood, pacing the narrow room, the old ache in his leg flaring from his injury overseas. He poured himself water, drank it down, then leaned against the desk. His reflection in the darkened window looked older than he felt lines carved deep into his face, hair thinning at the temples. He thought about Lewis again. He had always suspected the man wasn't guilty. Lewis had been green, naive, but loyal. Harlan had trusted him. If Crosswind had engineered the evidence, if they had sacrificed a man to protect their secrecy, then what else had they done? He clenched his fists. The program wasn't about justice. It was about control. And now it was back. The next morning, Harlan forced himself into routine. Morning formation, reports, inspections. Outwardly, he was the same calm, detached officer he had always been. Inwardly, he was a storm. He caught sight of Elena during formation. She stood at attention, face expressionless, eyes forward. But now, knowing what he knew, he saw her differently. She wasn't just a soldier standing in line. She was an operative, an outsider in a uniform, a pair of eyes that reported to someone far beyond this base. He wondered what she had been told about him. Later that day, he called her into the armory, under the guise of inventory verification. She arrived promptly, as always, carrying a clipboard. "Sir," she said, offering the log sheet. Harlan accepted it, but didn't read it. Instead, he studied her, searching for cracks in her facade. "Tell me something, Sergeant," he said quietly. "You ever hear the name Lewis?" "PFC Lewis. Kandahar, 2010. Her face didn't move, but her eyes flicked just for a second. She knew the name. "No, sir," she said flatly. Harlan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Don't lie to me. You know what happened to him." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Elena exhaled softly. "Sir, with respect, that's classified." The words cut like a blade. "Not I don't know. Not I wasn't there. Just classified." It was all the confirmation Harlan needed. That night, the past came rushing back with brutal clarity. He remembered Lewis's screams, the way the man had begged them to believe him. He remembered the hollow silence afterward, the way trust had shattered in the unit. He remembered staring at the empty bunk, wondering if he had failed one of his own men. Now, 12 years later, the ghosts had returned. And this time, Harlan wasn't sure he could stay silent. But speaking up carried risks. He knew that. Poking at something like Crosswind was dangerous. Files could disappear. Careers could end. People could vanish. As he sat alone in his office, the weight of it pressed on him. He thought about his duty, about the oath he had sworn. Protect his soldiers. Defend the Constitution. Uphold the truth. But what happened when truth itself was buried under classified labels and redacted files? The past had resurfaced, and it was demanding answers. Harlan knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't be able to let it go this time. Not again. The armory was quiet that evening, its racks lined with rifles gleaming under fluorescent lights. The smell of gun oil hung heavy in the air, a scent Captain James Harlan knew better than coffee. Normally, the space was his sanctuary, orderly, predictable, grounded in steel and inventory logs. But tonight, every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every sound sharper. He had asked Sergeant Elena Marquez to meet him under the pretense of another weapons check. She arrived precisely on time, boots clicking against the concrete floor. Clipboard in hand, she looked as composed as always, efficient, unbothered, a model non-commissioned officer. But Harlan knew better now. "Evening, sir," she said, voice crisp. "Evening, Sergeant," Harlan replied, locking the heavy steel door behind her. The sound echoed like a gavel. She raised an eyebrow. "That necessary?" "Just making sure we're not disturbed." He gestured to the workbench. "Have a seat." She hesitated, just briefly before pulling out the chair. Her body language was neutral, but her eyes never left him. Controlled, calculating. Harlan remained standing, arms crossed. "You've been here 6 months, Marquez. Quiet, efficient, never out of line. But there's something about you that doesn't fit. And I've stopped pretending I don't see it." Her expression didn't change. "With respect, sir, I don't know what you mean." "Oh, you do." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I saw your file. I saw the words stamped across it. Crosswind." For the first time since he'd known her, her mask cracked. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the mouth, a flicker in her gaze, but it was enough. She knew he wasn't bluffing. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "Maybe not," Harlan admitted. "But I did. And now I need answers." Silence stretched between them. Outside, distant voices echoed faintly from the parade ground, muffled by the thick armory walls. Inside, only the hum of lights and the faint tick of Harlan's watch filled the space. Finally, Elena exhaled and set the clipboard down. "Crosswind doesn't exist. Not officially. Not anymore. Don't give me the official line, Harlan snapped. I was there in Kandahar. I know what I heard. I know what happened to Lewis. Her eyes sharpened at the name. Then you understand why I can't talk about it. No, Harlan said firmly, slamming his palm against the bench. The sound made her flinch just slightly. What I understand is that I've got an operative embedded in my unit, watching my people like they're suspects. I understand that no one told me. And I understand that means someone thinks I can't be trusted with my own soldiers. Elena met his gaze. Steady now, the crack sealed. You want the truth, Captain? Fine. You've got a leak. Sensitive information has been leaving this base for months. Contractors, civilian staff, maybe even one of your officers. My job is to find out who. That's all you need to know. Her voice was sharp, clipped, but there was steel beneath it. Harlan's fists tightened at his sides. And you think the way to do that is by sneaking around in uniform, pretending you're supply? Watching us like we're criminals? Would you have preferred I show up in a suit and announce myself as counterintelligence? She shot back. How long do you think the mole would last in hiding then? The second people know they're being watched, the game's over. Her words rang with a hard logic. Still, Harlan felt the anger burning in his chest. And what about Lewis? Was that logic too? Because from where I was standing, Crosswind destroyed a good soldier. Something flickered in her eyes. Guilt? Regret? It was gone before he could be sure. Lewis was. Complicated, she said finally. I can't talk about the details. That's convenient. It's the truth. They stared at each other. Two soldiers on opposite sides of the same battlefield. Harlan felt the weight of his past pressing against him, demanding justice. Elena carried her secrets like armor, every word measured, every admission rationed. Finally, he spoke. So what now? You just keep watching us? Keep playing ghost until you find the mole? She leaned forward, her voice low. No, Captain. What happens now is you forget what you saw on that badge. You run your armory, you take care of your soldiers, and you let me do my job. If you dig deeper, if you make noise, you'll compromise the operation. And if that happens, people could die. The words landed heavy, each one a weight pressing on his conscience. Harlan studied her. She wasn't bluffing. Whatever she was here to stop, it was real. And dangerous. But still, the anger simmered. You talk about protecting lives. What about protecting trust? Soldiers rely on each other. If they find out there's a ghost in their ranks, everything breaks. Elena's eyes softened, just slightly. Trust me, Captain. I don't like it either. But sometimes shadows are the only way to keep the light safe. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the light seemed louder, the armory colder. Finally, Harlan exhaled and sat across from her. Fine, I'll stay out of your way. But if one of my soldiers gets burned because of this, because of you, I'll go over your head so fast, it'll make the Pentagon spin. Elena nodded. Fair enough. She rose from the chair, straightened her uniform, and picked up her clipboard. At the door, she paused. You were right about Lewis, she said softly, not turning around. He wasn't guilty. But he was necessary. Sometimes Crosswind makes sacrifices. Sometimes it has to. Then she unlocked the door and stepped out, leaving Harlan alone with the echo of her words. He sat there for a long time, staring at the rifles lined up in perfect rows. Soldiers trusted their weapons. They cleaned them, maintained them, depended on them. Weapons didn't lie. Weapons didn't keep secrets. People did. Crosswind was alive, moving in the shadows of his command. And now, Harlan wasn't sure whether Elena Marcus was his ally, or just another weapon pointed at his men. Rain had started to fall over the base, soft at first, then steady, tapping against the metal roofs and turning the gravel paths into slick streams. Captain James Harlan stood at his office window in the armory, watching the storm roll in. He'd always liked rain. It washed away dust, muted the chaos, made the world quieter. Tonight, though, it carried no peace. Elena Marcus's words haunted him still. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary. He had repeated them to himself all week, weighing them against his own convictions. He believed in duty, in protecting his men, in trust. But her world operated in shadows, where trust was a currency spent freely, and truth was rarely whole. Still, he had agreed to let her work, and that choice would be tested sooner than he imagined. The first alarm came at 2,200 hours. Harlan was cataloging rifles when the base loudspeakers blared to life. Security alert. Unauthorized data transfer detected. All personnel remain in quarters until cleared. His heart slammed against his ribs. Data transfer. Elena's warning came rushing back, classified information, leaving the base. He grabbed his sidearm, holstered it, and moved for the door. Before he reached it, it swung open. Elena stood there, soaked from the rain, her face pale but determined. "It's happening," she said. "What's happening?" "The mole. They're moving tonight." Her eyes locked with his, sharp and unflinching. In that moment, all pretense of secrecy was gone. She wasn't logistics, wasn't supply. She was Crosswind, and this was her battlefield. They moved quickly through dim corridors, boots splashing in shallow puddles. The storm outside masked their footsteps, thunder rolling like artillery in the distance. Elena carried no weapon, only a small device clipped to her belt that hummed faintly with blinking lights. "What's that?" Harlan asked as they jogged across the motor pool. "Signal tracker," she replied. "They've been transmitting packets all week, small enough to avoid detection. Tonight they got greedy, sent a full dump. Our system caught it before it got out." The signal originated from weapons storage. Harlan's blood ran cold. Weapons storage was his domain. "You're saying it's one of mine." "I'm saying whoever it is, they knew where to hide. Somewhere they could blend in." They reached the weapons division, a long, low building humming with generators. The door was locked, but Elena produced a keycard from her pocket and swiped it. Harlan didn't ask how she had it. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered weakly. Racks of rifles stood in neat rows, crates stacked high against the walls. And somewhere in the silence, footsteps echoed faintly. Harlan drew his pistol, motioning for Elena to stay low. She crouched, eyes locked on her tracker. The device beeped steadily, pointing them deeper into the storage bay. Then they saw him. Chief Warrant Officer Daniels. He was at the far end of the bay, hunched over a workbench. In his hands was a rifle stock, but not any standard issue piece. Harlan's trained eye spotted the modification immediately. The stock had been hollowed, a small compartment carved into its core. Inside, glinting under the overhead light, was a black data drive. Harlan's stomach turned. A mole, a traitor, and not just anyone. Daniels, a man he had trusted for years. "Daniels," Harlan called out, his voice steady but carrying authority. "Step away from the bench." The warrant officer froze. Slowly he turned, his face pale. His eyes darted between Harlan's pistol and Elena crouched nearby. "Captain," Daniels said, forcing a weak smile. "This isn't what it looks like." "The hell it isn't," Harlan snapped. "You're smuggling classified intel in a rifle stock." Daniels raised his hand slightly. "Listen to me. You don't understand. I had no choice. They've got my family. My son, he's in college. They said if I didn't cooperate." "Drop it," Harlan ordered, voice hard. "No." But Daniels didn't drop it. His hand twitched toward the bench, toward the pistol lying there. Don't, Elena warned, her voice sharp as steel. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The storm outside, the flickering lights, the three soldiers caught in a deadly triangle. Then Daniels lunged. Harlan fired. The shot cracked through the storage bay, echoing off metal racks. Daniels cried out, collapsing to the floor, clutching his leg where the bullet had torn through. The pistol he had reached for clattered harmlessly across the concrete. Elena was on him in an instant, her movements swift and precise. She kicked the modified rifle stock aside, yanked the data drive from its compartment, and secured it in her vest. Daniels groaned, blood pooling beneath him. "You don't know what they'll do to me," he gasped. "You don't know what they are." Elena crouched over him, her eyes hard. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you sold out your country." Harlan kept his pistol trained, breathing heavy, heart pounding. The man on the ground wasn't just a traitor. He was someone Harlan had shared meals with, worked alongside, trusted. Betrayal cut deeper than any wound. Military police stormed in minutes later, alerted by Elena's silent signal. They secured Daniels, cuffing him despite his protests. He begged for mercy, for understanding, but the MPs showed none. He was dragged away, his voice fading into the storm outside. Harlan holstered his pistol, staring at the empty bench. The rifle stock lay in pieces, the compartment exposed like a wound. Elena approached, her expression unreadable. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" Harlan muttered. "I just shot one of my own men. You stopped a traitor." "There's a difference." Harlan didn't answer. He felt hollow, his chest tight with a mix of rage and grief. Later, when the adrenaline had faded and the storm outside began to break, Harlan and Elena sat in the armory. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them wasn't hostile. No, it was heavy, weighted with the truth they both carried. Finally, Harlan broke it. "You knew it was one of mine." "I suspected," Elena admitted. Crosswind had flagged irregularities in weapons requisitions. Daniels had access. Too much access. "And you couldn't tell me?" She shook her head. "If I had, you would have treated him differently. He would have noticed. And he would have buried himself deeper. Sometimes the only way to catch a rat is to let it believe it's safe." Her logic was sound, but it didn't soothe the sting. Harlan leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I keep thinking about Lewis, about the way trust shattered in that unit. Tonight felt like déjà vu." Elena's voice softened. "Lewis wasn't handled right. I'll give you that. But tonight, we stopped it before more damage could be done." He turned his head, studying her. For the first time, he saw more than just the operative. He saw the weight she carried, the burden of being the unseen guardian. Maybe she wasn't his enemy. Maybe she never had been. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, puddles reflecting the dim lights of the base. Daniels was gone, locked away under guard. The drive was secured. But Harlan knew the storm wasn't over. Because if Daniels had been desperate enough to betray them, it meant there were others out there, pulling the strings. And Crosswind wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Elena stood, her silhouette framed by the open armory door. "Get some rest, Captain. Tomorrow, the paperwork begins. And after that, silence." "Silence?" She looked back at him, her eyes tired. "You'll see." Then she stepped out into the night, leaving Harlan alone with his thoughts, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in his ears. The morning after the storm, the base seemed unnaturally calm. Sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off wet asphalt and turning puddles into mirrors. Soldiers went about their routines as if nothing had happened. Morning PT, breakfast chow, roll call. To them, it was just another day. But to Captain James Harlan, everything felt changed. He had spent most of the night writing reports, carefully omitting details. The official story was straightforward. Chief Warrant Officer Daniels had been caught attempting to smuggle equipment. Resistance had been met, shots fired, and the subject detained. It was tidy, clinical, stripped of the truth. The real truth that Daniels had been a mole, that Elena Marcus had been Crosswind, that a covert operation had unfolded inside the weapons division, was nowhere in the paperwork. And Harlan knew it never would be. By noon, Daniels was gone, transferred under heavy guard to an undisclosed location. His name erased from morning duty rosters, his belongings removed from the barracks. To the soldiers, it was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Harlan watched the MPs load him into an armored vehicle, his wrists cuffed, his face pale with fear. Daniels didn't look at him. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he was still thinking about his family. Harlan couldn't tell. The vehicle rolled out, leaving behind silence. Later, Harlan went looking for Elena. He found her bunk stripped bare, her locker empty, her nameplate removed. Not a trace of her remained. He checked the personnel database again. Where once her file had been redacted, though it was, there was nothing. No entry, no record. It was as if Sergeant Elena Marcus had never served a day in the United States Army. Harlan sat back in his chair, staring at the empty screen. Crosswind had erased her. That night, he stayed late in the armory, moving through the familiar rows of rifles. He logged serial numbers, checked firing pins, counted magazines. The work was grounding, mechanical, the kind of routine that steadied his mind. But every so often, his eyes drifted to the workbench where Daniels had been caught, where the false stock had hidden betrayal inside steel. He thought of Lewis again, of Daniels, of Marcus. Three names tied together by shadows. Trust was the lifeblood of a unit. Soldiers depended on it more than weapons, more than rations, more than orders. Without trust, everything collapsed. And yet, the system itself had planted suspicion in their ranks, disguised as protection. Crosswind had saved them. But it had also left scars. Near midnight, as Harlan locked up the last weapons rack, he noticed something wedged under the workbench. A folded piece of paper. He pulled it free and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a single line written in neat block letters. Storms pass. Winds fade. Forget what you saw. No signature. No name. But he knew who had left it. Marcus. The words weren't a warning. They were a command. Forget. Move on. Pretend none of it had ever happened. Harlan stared at the note for a long time. Then he folded it again and tucked it into his pocket. He wouldn't destroy it. Not yet. Proof mattered, even if no one else could see it. Days passed. Routine returned. Soldiers joked in the chow hall, sparred in the gym, ran their drills. No one mentioned Daniels. No one asked about Marquez. The silence was deliberate, enforced by the weight of classified orders that had trickled down through the chain of command. Harlan went about his duties, outwardly unchanged. But inside, he carried a new burden. Every salute, every inspection, every logbook signed reminded him of the shadows that lurked beneath the surface of military life. Sometimes the enemy wore no uniform. Sometimes the enemy shared your table, your stories, your trust. And sometimes the only ones who saw it were ghosts like Crosswind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the base in amber light, Harlan walked the perimeter alone. He thought about Alana, her precision, her silence, her sharp eyes that had seen more than most ever would. He wondered where she was now. Another base? Another unit? Or gone altogether, absorbed into the ether of classified programs that left no trace? He would never know. And maybe that was the point. Weeks later, an inspector from division headquarters visited the base. Harlan sat across from him, reviewing inventory records. Everything was in order. No mention of Daniels. No mention of Crosswind. No mention of the night the storm had cracked open their world. The inspector signed the forms, shook his hand, and left. Routine carried on. But Harlan knew better. Truth was fragile in the military. Some truths were protected, enshrined in reports and medals. Others were buried, smothered under redactions and silence. Crosswind belonged to the latter. That night, Harlan returned to the armory alone. He sat at his desk, the note from Marquez in his hand. He read it again, the words stark in the dim light. Storms pass. Winds fade. Forget what you saw. He thought about ignoring the advice, about writing his own account and locking it in the safe. But he knew what would happen. It would be found. Erased, just like Marquez. He folded the note one last time and slipped it into the lining of his uniform jacket, close to his chest. A secret he would carry silently, just as she had carried hers. Outside, the night was quiet. The rain had stopped days ago, the air cool and still. Harlan stepped out of the armory, locked the heavy door behind him, and looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Storms pass, winds fade, but the memory remained. And in that silence, Captain James Harlan understood the truth. Some battles were never recorded, some heroes never named, some sacrifices never acknowledged. They lived only in the memories of those who bore witness. He walked back across the base, boots striking steady against the pavement. Routine resumed. But deep down, he knew he had crossed into a world where shadows kept watch, and not all ghosts stayed buried.